importance of human rights go back millennia. Nearly every society has had some form of the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The Hindu Vedas, the Code of Hammurabi, the Bible, the Quran, humanity's oldest written sources deal with issues of duties, responsibilities, and rights. After the atrocities of World War II, the nations of the world came together in 1948 to unanimously adopt the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. In 1966, these were further articulated into two treaties, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. As can be seen in the map behind me in red, nearly every country, 166 of them, have ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which, among other things, obligates governments to provide free primary education and progressively free higher education beyond that. 50 years later, these government obligations have not been met. According to the latest data from UNESCO, half of those countries have 1 out of 10 children not enrolled in primary or lower secondary school. When we look at the available completion data, the lack of the right to education spreads further to 89 of those countries where 1 out of 10 children are not completing primary or lower secondary school. And of course we know that those averages mask vast disparities. And if we look at the countries that are part of the Global Partnership for Education, you can see some correlation there with GPE channeling its resources to where it's needed most. We cannot wait any longer to fulfill these fundamental, basic human rights. At Results Educational Fund, we and our partners have launched a new initiative designed to close the gap between those promises and reality. The Right to Education Index is a global accountability initiative to monitor progress on the right to education, working with governments, civil society, and others to accelerate progress towards it. RTEI is not a top-down desk review index. It is a capacity-building research to advocacy program. Building on the work by the London-based Right to Education Project, which worked for years with human rights experts and academics to build a bank of indicators on the right to education, we've taken the 32 legally binding international and regional treaties related to the right to education, extracted 79 indicators related to government obligations, and put them into a questionnaire, a very large 200-page questionnaire. We work with civil society organizations to complete that questionnaire using national data. It's peer-reviewed by national research institutions and further made available to governments for additional review. Final results are used in reports and advocacy materials that are used by those partners in in-country advocacy campaigns on the right to education. RTEI operates on a 2-year project cycle, with the first year being research and data collection to complete the questionnaire, and the second year seeing support to a subset of partners to develop and implement advocacy strategies based on their findings. Ultimately, what forms is a platform for partnership and support for coordinated advocacy efforts around the right to education. In 2015, we piloted RTEI in 5 countries. In 2016, we ran our first official round in the 15 countries on the map behind me. And in 2017, we had our first RTEI advocacy year, where we worked with partners in Honduras, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Palestine, and Indonesia on issues like school reentry for pregnant students and young mothers in Tanzania, rights-based budgeting of SDG 4 in Palestine, alternative discipline policies to end corporal punishment in Zimbabwe, and teacher training on inclusive education in Indonesia. RTEI collaborates closely with the Global Campaign for Education, which is the world's network of national education coalitions in more than 100 countries. These are the civil society groups that are increasingly having seats at the policy-making tables in country in what GPE calls local education groups. And what we find is RTEI helping these partners and these coalitions to strengthen their inputs in these spaces and changing the discourse from one of general civil society demands and needs to one of clear government obligations to the treaties and agreements that it has ratified and how to fulfill those obligations. In Zimbabwe, school fees are established by Zimbabwe's Education Act as well as its education sector plan. But as found by ICOZI, the Education Coalition of Zimbabwe, school fees are, of course, not only detrimental to the poor, but they are in contravention to several of the agreements and treaties that Zimbabwe has ratified. In Honduras, Foro Dakar, the national coalition there taking its name from the Education for All goals that were established right here in Dakar in 2000, found that enrollment of children with disabilities is increasing, but 2/3 of schools are not pedagogically equipped to meet their needs. Foro Dakar worked with teachers, civil society, the National Board of Education, and technicians of Honduras's new education sector plan to address that issue. While it's a development institution, this type of rights-based planning and subsequent rights-based financing of education is really at the heart of GPE, in my opinion. The first strategic principle of GPE's strategic plan is that education is a public good, a human right, and an enabler of other rights. And we see this when we look across the indicators that are monitored by RTI. There's a large correlation with many of those indicators as found in GPE's own results framework. And what we see developing is a complementarity between the two, in which GPE is furthering the development agenda and civil society organizations are making progress and pushing on the human rights agenda. Those correlations are monitoring things like quality of education sector plans, public expenditure on education, the availability of trained teachers and learning materials, for example. We believe that this combination of leverage points can make real change. Gordon Brown is fond of calling education the civil rights struggle of our generation, but it is much more than that. Human rights are in many ways the pinnacle of what we as humanity are trying to achieve in our collective journey together. A world in which every man, woman, and child has their basic needs met and are allowing for growth and prosperity for all. We understand many of the challenges in front of us, but at the same time, we're at a very exciting point in history in which we have the right institutions in place and right platforms in place to move the needle on the right to education and really make it a reality through collective action. I'm Tony Baker, Associate Director for Global Education at Results Educational Fund, and I thank you for your time.